Hi, and welcome to the Existential Coach. This week's episode, I'm going to talk about distraction and getting underneath the distraction. And this is not a new topic, I think, as we think about our use of media as a way to distract ourselves, and the way we can use media as a way to play out dramas that themselves distract from what's going on beneath or under the distraction. We can start to ask questions about what is it that is so fundamental to needing a distraction that makes the distraction seem so vividly real. And regardless of your political views, or your religious views, or whatever they are, there are things that you hear said by people that just seem outlandish. And there are things that you say that seem absolutely true. And the distinction here is one works as a distraction and one doesn't. And so truth in this way can be understood as the phenomenon of believing the distraction. And so in that, the question becomes, what is it, as I mentioned earlier, that's so key about this distraction? Why is it such an implicitly necessary function that to not have it would be in some way problematic? Well, if we think about what a distraction is doing is it is allowing us to move away from something else. And what if the thing we're moving away from is actually more overwhelming? So what if recognizing the vulnerability of our situation is so perilous? Because to begin to open the doors that contemplate the real perils of our circumstance becomes such a compelling nightmare that we naturally think, I want out of this seemingly dead end, this abyss, this existential, nihilistic, pessimistic, destructive force, and I will do whatever it takes to survive. And by analogy, if we think about the ways in which people, and perhaps yourself, have done things to survive that you did because of that moment, you did because of that circumstance. And it would be different if you were in another situation, if things were calmer, if you had more choices, or if you didn't feel like you were pushed up against the wall, so to speak. But you were pushed up against the wall, and your reactions, the response to survive, is not actually, I would say, a survival instinct. And this might sound a little counterintuitive. There is this notion that we're all just pushing for survival, right? That we all just want to survive, and survival of the fittest, and a form of Darwinism or social Darwinism. And I think that's a prevalent idea, but it actually doesn't speak to what is a pretty obvious fact that we see, which is we do so many things that actually impede our survival and actually harm us, that what seemed like a developmental, or I should say evolutionary reason, i.e. survival of the fittest, really makes no sense. The idea that we will always do the thing that will allow us to survive just doesn't meet any basic observation of our lives, right? So an obvious example of this is the environment. And the way our environment is treated very much like a subjective opinion, which is to say, you have an opinion that there is a problem, somebody else has an opinion that there is not a problem, and then go to commercial, right? It's not really dealt with in the sense that, okay, if I want to survive and I need to survive in an environment, it would behoove me to have the most informed, up-to-date conversation, as if my drive is to survive, then I would want to, above all else, to know the facts. I would want to get out from this illusion that whatever it is that I understand the world to be, and however I feel that the world is ordered, may not actually bring me to what we're saying is this evolutionary function of survival. And that's because what I'm arguing here is we're actually not trying to survive. What we're trying to do is survive within our own constructed understanding of the world. And that is very different. So you could say an animal is very much striving to survive. So an animal, their leg is caught in a trap and they chew their own leg off. Or you could even say a human being in a situation like that is going to act in a way that fights for their ability to survive. But once we start getting into the cognitive level of contemplation, more specifically, we get into the way in which we manifest our idea, our conception of the world, then this whole idea of survival is now mitigated against the psychological state of survival, which is to say, psychologically, we want to maintain the order and the construct of our thinking, and we want to do it in a way that is eternal. And this is a form of delusion that is uniquely human, that we can see ourselves as being omnipotent, that we can tell ourselves we will last forever, that we won't die. And I'm not talking in the religious sense of an afterlife. I'm talking in the sense that you can have a variety of different people in a dangerous situation. They can be witnessing other people being harmed or killed, and the individual will still think, it's not going to be me. And this is a wiring, you could say, about our existence that I shouldn't use the term wiring so much as it's a psychological wiring. So I don't want to say this is a physiological wiring. I want to say this is a psychological wiring. And what this is doing is it's informing the way in which we function in our lives with a clear sense of certainty. But there's nothing to say that construct of certainty, which is created out of a necessity to exist as a self, actually measures up against the world we're in. So the illusion that I am operating within is that I will live in a situation where others die. Let's just think of a perhaps more commonplace example. This happens all the time with illness. I can eat things and do things that are not good for me and I can know it, but I'll be fine. Or I used to smoke, I can smoke, and I'll be fine. These aren't factually true. Now, there is always the story of the 96-year-old grandmother who smoked 3 packs a day. But exceptions being taken for what they are, exceptions, the trends say that to do certain things in a certain way will lead to our demise, our death. Yet, as I was saying earlier, if we pit that up against the underlying argument that we are wired to survive, it raises serious questions about the understanding of what survival actually is. And it's because we have a conceptual idea of what that is, and then we have a physiological experience of what that is, which is the real, right? We're placed against the annihilation of the body, which completely ends our life. Suicide has been said to be a physiological answer to a psychological crisis. So in a similar way, if we're thinking about these distractions, and we're thinking about getting underneath the distractions, do we start to move into the realm of this meaningless absurdity? And does that in and of itself set in motion an anxiety, an existential anxiety? And does this existential anxiety cause us to seek meaning. And is this meaning given to us in the form of distraction? Because a person can seek meaning in their life that is charitable, is focused on helping, for example, is holistic, thinking about the impacts and the way in which it does or does not impact others, or they can just zone out watching YouTube videos. Both of them could be constituted as a kind of distraction, yet one is clearly distinct from the other. And so when we get under the distraction, what I'm wondering is, how do we formulate our responses to whatever the given experience is? In other words, what's the patterns that emerge for us? And this is important because we learn these patterns, right? We learn what these patterns are from the people that we, let's say, watch on YouTube. And recently I watched just a clip of this person, Jordan Peterson, who is a bit of a touchstone for a lot of different people. And although I have talked about him at times, I try and steer away from it and him, because I think it brings tunnel vision to many conversations, and I find that to be unfortunate. So I'm only going to bring up this one small point. And he was talking about the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, and saying that Justin Trudeau is just a liar. Everything he says is a lie, and that's because he's a narcissist. And then he gives this kind of awkward example of what narcissism is, defining it essentially as that which does not meet his credo. Now, I would argue we're all narcissists, right? That we are all operating within our constructed design or credo or manifest destiny or whatever you want to call it. And it is framing our reality in a way that makes sense to us. But what was striking as I listened to Peterson in that little clip is I thought, here's a person who seems to me to be describing himself, and yet the game we're playing is this game of distraction. It's the interviewer and him were engaged in a kind of play where they are playing people that are telling you who they are, but saying that they are other people. And this evokes a kind of a projection and projective identification. In other words, it starts to get into this way of showing and revealing aspects of ourselves, yet it's cloaked within this distraction of the kind of pejorative comments spoken about in a certain tone or affect to dismiss, in this case, Justin Trudeau. But what it's really doing is actually kind of confessing this. And I found this to be interesting and something that I've not only heard in this context, but there is this kind of confession going on where his claims about Justin are so broadly given. And remembering he's studied psychology and he's well known in these fields. And I think that's interesting too, because that also starts to illustrate the way in which psychology and psychiatry is not as certain as psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists and counselors and so on want to present their work. So again, that is another form of distraction, the idea that there is certainty in this kind of alchemy of the psychological experience or the phenomenological experience, when really what there is experience. And within that, there can be a kinship, there can be an exploration, there can be an exploration of the experience and sharing of that experience with others. But the notion that it would create certainty starts to become a distraction against the underlying existential phenomenon of uncertainty, which is to say, when we are saying things are just what they are, when we are saying this is the right way, really what we're offering is a distraction. So we can say the environment is an issue or the environment is not an issue, And you, the consumer, the ideological consumer, can pick whatever fits best for you, and you can have the distraction that best suits your way of wanting to exist. It's kind of like putting on a jacket or a pair of pants or a shirt or a blouse or something that you fit and you feel good in, and it feels like it shows off some aspect of yourself, but it is a distraction. So in a way you could say, I'm kind of asking the question, can we be ideological nudists? Which may seem kind of bizarre. But I come to this, I think, in a kind of measured way, because to pick one or to pick the other, you can say one's better, you can say one has more evidence, one has less evidence, you can do all of these different things. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, when people are sitting down and looking at scientific research, they're not actually coming to it from the perspective of science. They're coming from the perspective that science has more merit than no science. But it's just as superficial in their minds. In other words, their understanding is just as inconsequential as any form of blind rhetoric. What this suggests is it was actually about the brand rather than the coherence of the underlying principles and the methodology used in the research and all of these kinds of things. So if that is the case, then really what we're looking for is some form of cloaking, some form of distraction, some form of getting away from what is beneath this underlying, getting to this underlying phenomenon of uncertainty. And so to circle back to the Peterson example and hone in on psychology, psychiatry, and all the rest of it, there is within this field a real fallacy that what we're doing in this work is science. Now, I think there's a lot to be said for what we're doing and what's happening in this work, yet I don't know if it's helped by pretending it's doing more than what it is, which is, I don't know if it helps to say, here's a new ideology, when really the crisis that we're facing is, can we get beneath the distraction? Now, circling back to the environment, which is the first example I used, my sense is we really don't have the collective tools to address collective issues. The only caveat being, if there's a financial impetus and that is framed within exploitation, then there might be whatever measures taken to meet the needs of that end. However, exploitation by its very nature means not everyone can benefit. And an environmental solution is a solution about the planet. It is by definition, you could say, a socialist solution. And the paradox here is, if the distraction that we have come to accept as being the way we need to escape our underlying existential sense of dread is to avoid all things that unify, then we are fundamentally existing in a state of crisis. And if we are existing in a state of crisis, we are operating within a framework of trauma. And if we are operating within a framework of trauma, we are operating within a framework of fragmentation. And fragmentation deconstructs any and all form of so-called normative or coherent existence because we have experienced a loss of time. And it is that annihilation of time that entirely usurps the way in which we can find ourselves experiencing and co-experiencing with others a sense of existence that is safe and foundationally secure. When Peterson says Trudeau is just a liar, he's saying that there is danger. He's also saying that you can focus all of your danger and your vitriol and your concern and your whatever it is on him. This, I would argue, is disingenuous. if this was the case, if there was one political figure, be it Justin Trudeau or whomever, that could be pulled down and then everything would become good, what we would be doing is saying that there is actually no systemic issue. There is only an individual. It's a grand form of the bad apple argument. And what it does not acknowledge is the way in which systemic issues functionally create dynamics that are sustained like trauma patterns, and that these patterns repeat regardless of the subject. However, and this is going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, however, given the way we understand ourselves in the world and the narrow design, the construct, the credo, whatever it is that we have for understanding that we exist, the idea that that can be taken apart, the idea that it can fall apart, the idea that we cannot exist within that framework is too much for us to actually embrace. Therefore, accepting things like scapegoats, it's all Justin Trudeau, it's all whomever, doesn't acknowledge that the systemic issues that are at play actually draw within us, or draw out from within us, a kind of complicity. Which means we are the face of other. We are the enemy within. We are our own worst enemy. We are the vile that we speak against. We are the darkness that we shy away from or run from. And interestingly, if we can embrace this dynamic within ourselves, we can start to see that this implicit form of understanding actually gives us a great insight into others. So again, drifting back to the Peterson example, I'm seeing him as a person confessing, and he finds other people to be complicit with, that they say that this isn't he's not confessing, they say that in fact he's giving us information. But I would argue that what we're really talking about is a form of projection that brings us towards some form of, we'll call it destruction, but I want to marry that world with creation. That within these projections there is a potential to unlock a understanding that goes beyond what we may be comfortable with. That in my looking at Peterson, really I was looking at someone, in my view, that is looking for some form of attention, that is finding a sense of satisfaction, a sense of meaning, a sense of, well, I'm going to say momentum. There's this kind of character momentum that exists, and that this is, in whatever way, giving him something of a stage. And that stage is the distraction. And if we go underneath it, the problems he has, the problems that I have, the problem that you have, start to become a lot more alike and a lot less dissimilar. The issues that Prime Minister Trudeau faces are similarly issues that we all face. Of course, there are differences, yet there is fundamental connection within the experiences, and unless we start to look at these connections, we won't be able to look at the systemic issues. So what does this all mean? Well, the distraction most fundamentally dissuades us from seeing the underlying connections, the systemic issues, and then addressing them holistically or collectively in a way that understands not what they are in terms of good or bad, but what they are in terms of how our existence is an unfolding form of creative destruction. And if we do that, if we look into these darker sides of ourselves, which may haunt us in a variety of different ways, we just may find that within these aspects and dimensions of our own being, we feel less the need to scapegoat or blame, as in the case of the Peterson example, and more of a need to connect and realize there are fundamental things that we can look at and explore collectively. So before I wrap up, let me just kind of basically summarize some of these ideas and how this can be relevant or might be relevant in our day-to-day lives. Well, if we're watching a YouTube video and we're being presented with somebody who's giving us the answers and making blanket statements, and we find that appealing, can we ask ourselves, what's so appealing about one-word answers? What's so appealing about one-brush solutions? Well, the answer is it fights any form of complexity. It resists any form of complexity. It offers us a simple way out. Well, why might we like that? Well, we're feeling overwhelmed. Well, why might we feel overwhelmed? Well, housing is unstable, the environment's unstable, food costs, all of the different things that are going on give us ample reason to say the world is messed up. And so if somebody comes along and gives us a solution, regardless of how outlandish it is, we can start to realize that really what we're doing is we're looking not for survival in terms of, like I was mentioning earlier, physiological survival. We're looking for psychological survival within a world gone mad. And it is this perpetual state of madness that deforms our way of accepting ourselves and others. And so in seeing Peterson and seeing others and feeling this rage, this dismissal, this frustration, I don't see that leading to a path of anything but more dismissal, negation, and destruction. And so the challenge becomes, how do we take that which haunts us and turn that into that which heals us? How do we move from falling backwards to falling forwards? How do we stand when there is nothing to stand on? How do we give when we have nothing to give? How do we take as the only fundamental act of our forgiveness? In other words, how can we find ourselves in an experience without trying to define what that experience is? Can we be open enough, curious enough? Can we endure the uncertainty, the lack of familiarity, the frustration, the hostility? Can we find that which does not exist and accept it in a manner in which we do not and cannot understand? Can we close our eyes and wonder? Can we close our eyes and dream? I think that question, can we dream, that shifts things in my mind. Can we move away from the linear trajectories, starting to look at the way in which things link and transform, and before our eyes start to have meaning and movement, feeling and effect in ways that are not restricted to or limited to certain ways of understanding what survival is, certain ways of understanding what good is, what bad is, but rather start to find within ourselves a form of exploration that in and of itself is the foundation of a kind of certainty that is much more forgiving. So this was a bit of an improv on this idea that watching that Peterson video, but it has me thinking about what is it that I can do to try and explore any sense of certainty that I may seek, and am I comfortable with challenging things, and can I step back and move under the distraction and close my eyes and dream? So until next time, bye for now.